everybody. So first off, I wanted to introduce the people who will be presenting and sharing some information today. My name is Jackie Jamison. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a soil health extension instructor with the University of Idaho and NRCS. Linda Schott will also be presenting today. She's an extension specialist with the University of Idaho, and Shawn Nield will also be presenting. He's a state soil scientist with NRCS. You'll also see a lot of other familiar faces throughout the day today, but really excited to be here and sharing some information and results specific to the Magic Valley Soil Health Project, of which the conservation districts have also been extremely supportive and very, very involved with. So want to shout out that support and thank yous as well. So quickly before we get started today, I do want to mention and just give everyone a heads up that we will be recording today's session for future playback and for folks who are unable to actually attend in person today. So did want to give that heads up that this whole session will be recorded. And I also wanted to give a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today and kind of a general agenda for the day. So for today, we are going to be doing three kind of smaller, shorter presentations. We're going to start out with,
go out and try to figure it out.
if everyone could, this is actually a good point to touch on housekeeping. If everyone could keep yourself muted while, unless you are talking, that would be super helpful, just to keep background noise down. So today's presentations will start with Shawn Nield. He'll be going over some of NRCS's draft practices supporting soil health, talking through specifically soil carbon amendment and in-field soil health assessments. We're going to follow that session up with up to 15 minutes of discussion questions specifically related to those practices in that presentation. After that, we'll move on to Linda Schott, who will go over a project overview for the Magic Valley Soil Health Project, either for those of you who are unfamiliar with it or just as a refresher for those who are familiar with it. And then she'll move into the chemical results from this year for that project. We'll follow that up as well with up to 15 minutes of discussion specifically around what she talks about. And then we'll move on to a presentation about the Soil Your Undies campaign from this year, which we have some fun results to share on. We'll follow that up with a discussion about the undies, and then we'll move into more informal discussion, more soil health forum style, for those who are interested in talking about soil health practices, et cetera, that may not be directly related to the presentation topic today. So that's the general layout of how we're going to run through things today. I do want to, again, bring up a couple of housekeeping points. I already mentioned, but if you could keep yourself muted unless you're actively talking, that would be excellent, just to keep background noise down. If you do have questions or comments or things to share, two great options for that, just to keep things streamlined, is use the raise your hand function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation to make sure everyone gets addressed. Or you can enter questions, comments, etc., into the chat box itself, and we'll be monitoring that as well. I think that's all that I have for now, unless Linda or Shawn have anything to add to that. Excellent. Then without further ado, we will move on to Shawn. Thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, let's see if I can make this work. All right, does that look right? So Jackie, you're getting the presentation in its normal mode there?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, good. All right, so this presentation really is just to talk about a draft practice that we're evaluating right now and we'd like to release in the very near future. And that happens to be tied into our in-field soil health assessments and the worksheet that's involved with that. And so I'll just dive right into this and we'll go through it together. Let's see. So the soil carbon amendment draft conservation practice, what this is, it's a conservation practice to address soil quality resource concerns. And that's not to say that it's the only conservation practice to address soil quality resource concerns. Obviously, there's quite a few others in our toolkit. You know, things like cover crops and no-till, reduced-till, strip till, nutrient management can play a part in there, prescribed grazing, et cetera. But this is one that is under evaluation. It's a draft practice, and we're going through it. And I thought I would share some of the details of that with you. It's a practice that uses carbon-based amendments to improve soil organic matter, soil aggregate stability, habitat for soil organisms, plant productivity, and or efficient use of irrigation water. Now, in order to utilize this conservation practice, it requires an in-field soil health assessment be completed. Now, that assessment, it takes a lot of different things into account. There's some management considerations. It looks at surface conditions, some of the subsurface conditions, uses a real straightforward evaluation methodology and tools. As an example, you can see on that little list on the right. Here we're talking basic stuff like a shovel and a pin flag, or if you want to be fancy, a penetrometer, clear plastic cups for or wire sink strainers for slate test and aggregate stability test, hand lens, texture by field guide, which if you don't have those, your field office should be able to provide them. If they don't have them, get in touch with me. I'll send you a box of them. Everybody's got a camera, so, you know, in their pocket with their cell phone. So what's required in terms of tools to go through the in-field assessment is pretty straightforward. And this involves a soil conservationist and the producer working together to go through this. This direction. Here's an example of what that in-field assessment worksheet looks like. This is kind of a busy slide, but let me break it down for you real quick. There's 11 indicators in that list. Now, those indicators are evaluated to determine the presence of soil health resource concerns. Those resource concerns are in the little box there. The soil health resource concerns are compaction, soil organic matter depletion, aggregate instability, and soil organism habitat loss or degradation. The indicators, when several of those indicators don't meet assessment criteria, in other words, you have inadequate soil cover, you're getting lots of ponding, you have high penetration resistance, et cetera. When several of those indicators don't meet assessment criteria, a resource concern is validated. We say, yeah, we do have a soil health resource concern based on what we saw in the field. So, next slide. To give you an example, rather than go through all 11 of the indicators and so on, I don't want to kill you with the details of this thing, but to give you an example, if you were to go through this real simple decision tree to answer the question, do we have a soil organic matter depletion resource concern? Let's say we went into the field, we looked at soil cover, that's a surface condition, and say there wasn't even 25% cover. And our biological diversity, we didn't see any, we saw very few soil critters, like no fungal hyphae, there was no nodulation in our legumes, we didn't see any earthworms, and therefore there were no biopores showing up in our soil. We would say, yeah, we qualify as saying we have a soil organic matter depletion resource concern. And so that gets documented on the form. Give you another quick example of utilizing these. And these decision trees they're in the back sheets on this form. Looking at aggregate instability. Now, aggregate instability, all you really need is the slake test or the wire sink strainer test to show aggregate instability. But in this example, I've got some pictures on the right. Say we had surface crusting and you're inhibiting your seedlings, and you've got ponding. You know, your infiltration is really low. Water's running away and ponding in low spots, and you fail the water stable aggregates indicators. Well, we definitely have aggregate instability that qualifies as a soil health resource concern. So again, that's the type of thing we document on here, and then that makes the applicability of this practice standard. It becomes something that we can use to address those resource concerns. So this is just a screenshot of the title of the thing that we're looking at and evaluating. And it defines this practice, this soil carbon amendment practice standard, as just using carbon-based amendments to increase soil carbon and improve physical, chemical, and biological properties. I think I went through this earlier, more specifically to improve organic matter, aggregate stability, habitat for soil organisms, plant productivity, and efficient use of irrigation water. I should say I've added some illustrations of these slides on the back end of this because they were awfully boring. And I'll give you a link to these. These are from a soil health booklet, a children's booklet that was produced by John Stika and his daughter. And John is a retired NRCS employee and quite the commendable career, and a real soil health proponent. And this children's booklet is just super cute. And so I've dressed up some of these slides with some of the illustrations out of that. And we'll have that booklet will be available for download off of the Idaho NRCS Soil Health website here in a couple of days. But at any rate, what qualifies as a carbon amendment? Here we talk about compost, biochar, or other regionally appropriate materials such as sawdust, pulverized paper, distillation residue, whatever's locally available that could be composted gets lumped into this other regionally appropriate materials. And of course, there are stipulations for all of these. We've already mentioned that you have to have the soil health documented as a resource concern. This is something that we're spending some time on right now. There's a physical and chemical amendment analysis that's the responsibility of the provider of the material, or where it's produced on site. The producer has to have the material tested by a lab that participates in the North American Proficiency Testing Program. For the compost, they indicate, now this draft standard, this comes from our national folks, and then we evaluate it for use in our state. So we're looking at language here that was drafted nationally, and this is a part that I think we're gonna do a little work on it. For the compost, it says use compost that's analyzed for the following parameters according to the test methods for the examination of composting and compost, or by other land grant university recognized methods. And I've got some inquiries with our folks at the university to see what we might be able to put together there. That TMECC methodology, yeah, there's a handful of labs that advertise that, but scattered across the country, there's only like 8 or 9 of them, and the testing's super expensive, or at least in my opinion it is. At any rate, the basics of what that analysis should reveal for the compost is its maturity index, carbon to nitrogen ratio, between 15:1 and 30:1 at maturity. The idea is we don't want it too low or too high, because we don't want to be risking nitrogen loss or immobilization. So that's why they put those on there. They want 40 to 60% moisture content at maturity, and the analysis has to report carbon and nitrogen content, phosphorus, potassium, pH, soluble salts, organic matter, and bulk density. Biochar requirements, basically they just say use biochar that's produced by heating biomass to a temperature in excess of 350 C under controlled or limited oxygen conditions. And that biochar analysis has to report carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and pH. And obviously, don't create biochar from crop residues that could otherwise be left on the field to provide soil protection and improve soil organism habitat. We can't be robbing Peter to pay Paul here. Other considerations, if your applications near water bodies, we want to follow some setbacks for spreading, and they reference our conservation practice 590 nutrient management. Don't spread the amendment more than 2 inches thick. Don't apply rates that exceed plant nitrogen or phosphorus requirements of the current crop or that create unacceptable risk of nitrogen or phosphorus loss. There's some other common sense stuff, don't apply during peak erosion periods, to native grasslands, to frozen or snow covered fields, to slopes greater than 15%, to sensitive areas, or to fields where a crop won't be able to utilize the nutrients. That's just common sense stuff. They make a note in there too about the analysis or certification of the materials should identify potential contaminants associated with the compost materials. I think they have to throw that in there just in case there's some materials that are locally available for composting that could have some issues with some sorts of contaminants. Documentation of the application rate, timing, and method of the application that's going to be done needs to be in there. There needs to be soil test results before the application. That's to set up the kind of the baseline that you're going to compare to later, because you're going to go back in operation and maintenance, and you're going to monitor fields with follow-up soil analysis. They also indicate too that that fields need to be inspected after the initial application, after your first heavy precip, to determine its stability. Obviously, you don't want it your application running away. And other common sense stuff. Obviously, you're going to need to determine the type of calibration needed for accurate distribution, which will have to do with your equipment and so on. And then considerations for assistance on this include the cost, transport, and application of the material itself. And then that's provided under scenarios of just using compost only, or just using biochar, using a compost plus biochar mix, or using regionally available products. And again, I think the reason they've separated that out and made that a little bit different is that's where you've got something that's regionally available. There's a lot of it, and it comes at a negligible cost. So they throw that in there. But this, again, this is not the be-all, end-all for addressing soil quality resource concerns. It's just another tool that we're evaluating to have in our toolbox that could be available out there. And we're hoping that to have something, to have a version of this out and available by the end of February. And last thing, I just want to, here's the Soil is Alive. It's the children's booklet that I talked about. That's going to be available from our Idaho NRCS soil health website in a couple days. Otherwise, I would have provided the link, but it's not up yet. But if it's free for download, really good explanation of what soil health is and how soil functions, and the illustrations can't be beat. With that, I am more than happy to take any questions. Somebody, anybody?
Yeah, Shawn, Pat Purdy here. Thank you for the presentation.
Hey, you bet.
So I have my wife tells me I have a bad habit of not listening, so or not paying attention. So this all looks great, but I guess ultimately, what's the point of it? Is there some funding available? Is there you qualify for this? You get this assessment done, and then if you have some soil health concerns, there's some funding available through some NRCS program.
Right. So yeah, and somebody like Steve's probably better suited to talk about how our business model for applying conservation works. But I will say that so that yes, there's if this is a conservation practice that's part of a conservation plan that you've qualified for, then there will be assistance, some financial assistance involved with this, and the details of that are being worked out, and there are a variety of things that are enumerated in terms of the different scenarios of, you know, is this a deal where we're just applying compost, or are we doing the compost plus biochar? Do we have some regionally available byproduct of some sort that's available at negligible cost? And then there's, you know, the cost of the material itself, transport of the material, application of the material, testing of the material. Those things are taken into consideration in terms of what can be covered. So yes, that's and Steve, you might want to jump in here if there's anything I need to say about how that sort of thing might work.
Well, we can. This is pretty exciting. We can visit about this extensively in our next local work group meeting, and because our soil health practices are kind of limited, and this would be a real good tool and add to that. But no, this will fit right in really easily with the EQIP program.
Okay, yeah, Pat, I hope that answers your question. That yes, there's assistance available for folks that qualify. I guess I just leave it like that.
Okay, and who does the analysis? I guess you have to have a soil health concern to qualify. So
right, and so you'd work
analysis.
Yeah, absolutely, and you'd work with your local soil conservationist for the in-field assessment, if that's the part that you're talking about there. And that's something, those in-field assessments, one thing that we're looking at right now, I would have liked to have had in this coming spring, I would have liked to have had in-person trainings at a couple different locations across the state for folks to go through the indicators and just spend a day in the field getting really comfortable with that, because this will be the first practice that I'm aware of anyway that requires that as documentation. This is something that we're looking at and saying, well, we can't do that now because of pandemic concerns, but nothing really prevents me from going out and covering the test for those indicators with a video and having that available to anyone, or even coming out and doing a kind of a socially distanced deal in the field with a soil conservationist and a producer that's interested, and we could go through that. But yeah, the idea is that here in the near future, you would go just to your local soil conservationist, and they would go into the field with you and run through those indicators to document a soil quality resource concern.
It looks like Barry has a question. He's got his hand up.
Excellent.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing any.
Yep, he just unmuted.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you're talking, Barry, but we can't hear you.
If you'd like to enter your question into the chat, that also works.
Yes.
Yeah, and additionally, I'm available to talk to. I can enter my email in the chat after I'm done with my part here, and if folks can feel free to contact me.
Looks like Marlon has a question.
Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you again. Hey, Shawn, go back up to the soil health assessment guide. Maybe
Sure.
your first slide. I just wanted to clarify just a tiny bit. Keep going. Where? Oh, right here. So go down one slide or go up a slide. I want to where it shows the 4 resource concerns. Right there, right there.
Yep.
So the resource concerns are not necessarily soil health, that they're compaction resource concerns, organic matter depletion resource concern, aggregate instability resource concern. So it's kind of fun to say they're soil health resource concerns, but they're just they're not soil health resource concerns. They're individual resource concerns. And for guys like Pat, this is really a good little tool to do on your own. But if you want NRCS help, that's really great to partner up with your NRCS partner, or I'm sure a county extension agent could do this with a producer, no problem at all. And it's about a 15-page document, I think, Shawn. It shows, gives some good instructions of how to do it. But
yeah, it's there's a lot of illustration in it. It's written very straightforward, and for any one of these indicators, there's a couple paragraphs and some photos. And I think kudos to the Soil Health Division for this document. It's one of the better things we've done. I think in terms of I don't know if you want to call it a job aid or whatever, but it's well done. And yeah.
And when the Soil Health Division made this document, it's really the only way we could figure out how to have NRCS employees identify these 4 types of resource concerns. And so we can use other tools like Russell or WEPS to evaluate wind erosion, but this is kind of our suggested tool for states on how to analyze and document these 4 resource concerns. Very good, Shawn.
Thank you, Marlon.
Shawn, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I was wondering if you have any sort of ballpark idea of when these practices might move from draft status to active status.
Well, like I said, by the end of February, we'd like to have this available.
Excellent.
Yeah. Oh, and Jackie, I should, any feedback you get from your extension cohorts on the analysis part, I'd love to hear, and I'd love to hear directly from them too. But yeah, that analysis language in there is something that we need to talk about. If the university can pitch in on a type of compost analysis that folks could seek out if they needed to.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, I don't see any other hands up or questions in the chat. So I think we'll move on to the Magic Valley Soil Health Project. If Linda Schott wants to start sharing screen and sharing some information.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm Linda Schott, and I'm just going to talk super briefly about, in general, like 2 slides on soil health and, the standard definition, talk a little bit about the project background, and then a little bit on the chemical analysis. I'm not going to go into nitty-gritty details, and there's a reason for that I'll get to in a minute. And then it's really just to lay the groundwork for the Undies project, because I think that was really the bread and butter for this year and kind of the fun thing. And so we want to end on that. So you just have like 20 minutes between that, or between me and having to hear that, getting to hear about that part. So soil has function. And so I like to think of soil health as what function that particular soil should be serving. And so if you think about cropland, it should be an anchor for crop roots. So you shouldn't necessarily, if the wind picks up, you shouldn't be losing all of your baby sugar beets. You may not have healthy soil because it's not really anchoring the plants that well. It needs to provide water, air, and nutrients for the plants to grow, habitat, living filter. So if we think about septage fields from septic systems, that's a relatively common project, a relatively common practice in rural areas. And then also for, other functions would be to support buildings, roads, and other structures, although we don't so much care about that with cropland. And so always go back to thinking healthy soil in rangeland is going to look different than healthy soil in cropland, which is also going to look different than healthy soil kind of in an urban or homestead environment. And this is just the basic definition. Again, the ability for soil to function as a living ecosystem that supports plants, animals, and humans. And it's the nexus of these physical, chemical, and biological properties. And really, it's that biological part that we talk a lot about. And unfortunately, this year, in odd or in even years of this 5-year project, we're not doing biological assessments. It's the most expensive part of this project. And so really all we had was the chemical. And I guess we did a little bit of biological with the undies, but not so much of just the true lab test indicators. So these properties are highly related and interconnected. So if you have poor physical structure in your soil, then and it's compacted, your crops can't necessarily pick up the nutrients that you've applied to the soil because there's not enough air and water exchange for those plant roots to survive or to get deeper. Same thing if you don't have a lot of biology to help with nutrient cycling and to help kind of move those nutrients from an immobile form into something that the plant can take up. You're not reaching your full potential for the chemical properties. And if it's compacted, again, there's not enough air and water, so the biology can't really live anyway. So super, super connected. And so there's a lot of metrics that can serve multiple purposes to kind of get at that. I know some of you are on your cell phone, but I like asking some little poll questions kind of to break up the presentation. And so my first question is, do you have soil health goals? And actually, that's not the question. I just changed it because I was looking at the participant list and I felt like it was going to not include everyone. So really, it's how important is soil health to you and your clients. I should have changed that slide. And you can either use this QR code to go straight to it, or you can go to slido.com and enter this, this password. And so I'll give everyone a couple of minutes. And this is probably a leading question since you guys are all in a meeting titled January Soil Health Forum, but maybe you're just here kind of on the, it's not really important to you, but you're trying to find out more, or maybe it's important to you, but not your clients. Feel free to answer it however you feel you want to. So if you want to talk about it in terms of who you represent or yourself or anything in between. It's just to gauge the room. And again, also to kind of break this up a little bit, even though we've barely gotten started. And so it looks like, I mean, not too many people have responded yet, but you can see on this graph that the majority of people view it as very important, but there are still some that are moderately important. And when I give this specific poll, this is a question I ask a lot, it tends to be a little bit more broken out. There tends to be some people who say not at all important and they're just there for the CEU credits. And there's others that it's, you know, very important. So it is nice to see that I'm giving this presentation to a group that's hopefully interested. And you can continue to answer this poll as I keep moving through this. So one thing I like to talk about is kind of in this framework of like how I'm interested in soil health, but how do I improve my soil health, or what am I doing? And I really like this kind of this image showing the 4 principles of soil health. It's actually 5. Grazing, maximizing, like, you know, grazing and livestock, reincorporating livestock into the system is the 5th one. But there's not a ton, I mean, there's, you know, only a handful of practices that go with that. And I probably should update it, but this is the 4 original principles of soil health. And they can be, and those are maximize continuous living roots, maximize biodiversity, minimize disturbance, and maximize soil cover. And those fall into 2 categories of feeding and fueling your soil biology, or protecting what you already have. And so really you can, hopefully you're doing practices that account for all 4 or 5 of these principles. But as long as, I mean, something is better than nothing. So even if you're just protecting the carbon you have, that's better than like not protecting it at all, right? It's all about that incremental change. Shoot, I messed that up. But so I also looked at this, of all of these practices. You can see most of them that kind of fit into this, and a lot of them fit into multiple categories. So if cover crops, you can't see it in 2 of them, but it maximizes continuous living roots, it maximizes diversity, and it also maximizes soil cover. So if you do incorporate cover crops, you're hitting 3 of the 4. But there's also a lot of other ones that are sort of, I'm going to consider low-hanging fruit, like don't till when your soil is wet. That will help minimize your disturbance. Reducing your tillage by even 1 or 2 tillage passes is also going to go a long way to maintaining some of the soil carbon you have. Doing nutrient management, so when you to do soil sampling and then only apply the nutrients that your crop needs, and probably even, if you can, splitting those nutrient applications. And the other point is there's multiple ways to improve soil health, so you should pick the best method for you. We hear a lot about tillage reduction and cover crops, and those are phenomenal practices, phenomenal. But there's also a lot of other things that you can do. And one thing that I always like to point out that producers here have an advantage over producers in the Midwest is the fact that we do have these long crop rotations with a lot of diversity. So if you think about the Midwest, it's corn continuously or corn and soybeans. So they don't really have a lot of diversity in their cropping rotation. Whereas here, a lot of producers have 4 or 5 years worth of rotation where they have 3 or 4 crops that they're growing. So that is already a step ahead, and there's already some practices that you might already be doing that fall into improving soil health. And so the next question for Slido is, I'm just curious about which of the following practices, if any, have you implemented on your land or land you manage? And this is really aimed at those producers that are on the producers or land managers that are on this presentation today. So I've activated it. You go to the same link. It's the hashtag or pound F355, and you can also use this QR code. So there's a lot of different options here of different management practices like cover crops or double cropping. Anything that you're kind of going above and beyond to keep something growing. There's minimum or reduced tillage, strip tillage, and you all can pick multiple things too. There's residue retention, so maybe after your grain crop, you're only cutting and baling a little bit, you know, less than what you did, or maybe not at all. You're trying to keep it covered. there's multi-year crop rotation. And so this was just saying like you're growing a multitude of crops over multiple years, rather than, you know, kind of that comparison between you all and those in the Midwest. There's also rotational grazing that I like to talk about. I also think that manure and compost application is a really great way to get carbon into your system, and it does have soil health benefits. And so that's also a practice that I think is important to think about. And then, you know, going back to that nutrient management, are you soil sampling on an annual basis and trying to just apply the nutrients that your crop needs? And so it looks like a lot of you are doing no-till. There's also a lot of manure and compost applications, cover crops or double cropping, kind of that reduced tillage, those multi-year.
And Linda, apologies for interrupting. It does sound like folks are only able to choose one of these options on there. So there may be more reflected than are actually seen in this survey result here.
Okay.
Just ahead.
I'm just having technological difficulties. You think by this point in the virtual game that I would have figured this out, but I must have not clicked that box. But anyway, you all can continue answering that if you want to, but it does look like that maybe reduced tillage is one of the more popular things. So then really getting into this project, it was started in 2019, so last year, well, 2 years ago, because it's already 2021. And the question was, what does healthy soil in the Magic Valley look like? We hear a lot about soil health in the Midwest and what those producers are doing. But obviously our soils are different. Our climate is very different. Crop rotations, we have different management practices because you have so many crops. There's different types of irrigation. I mean, you name it, and there's probably differences within the Magic Valley, but also between us and the Midwest. And so that was the basic question. So in 2019, we started off with 32 fields. So we went out and we sampled 32 fields. And this is just a really backed out map showing that spatial distribution. It's a little hard to read, and that's a little intentional because we don't want to give away the exact field locations. And then we lost one producer, but we gained 3 more. So we sampled 34 fields in 2020, and we're not going to add any more producers after this. We're set. We're going to keep these 34 fields from here on out to make kind of our data analyses a little bit easier, although, I mean, it's always going to be difficult with this type of distribution and crops and management practices. So I also wanted to remind you in odd years, so 2019, it'll be this year, and then the final year of the project in 2023, we're doing the full suite of analyses. So we're looking at physical, chemical, and biological properties, and sending most of those off to commercial labs, except for the physical properties. And we're also we threw in Soil Your Undies, but we're also going to do that probably moving forward. We just didn't do it in 2019. And we're also adding aggregate stability too, because we think that that's a really great metric to be looking at. And so there's potential that we could add, if there's interest and it's not too expensive or difficult. If you have any suggestions of other assessments we can be doing, let us know. So then in even years, it's a really consolidated list. So this year we did Soil Your Undies, and we intend to do that moving forward if we can, because it was kind of fun to see those results. And then chemical testing, and that's just really to get that continuity in the project. But we were talking, and just showing chemical these reports is not that interesting, mainly because it's difficult to see through the weeds. There's so many crops. When we soil test, when we're taking these soil samples, the crop is growing. And most of the fertilizer has already been applied. And so it's difficult to say broadly to track this, other than maybe organic matter. And we are And I'll get into a little bit more here in a minute. So I just also wanted to show, so all of our commercial samples are sent to Ward Lab. And that's because they give a really good deal to university personnel for sending these samples in. So we get like 40% discount, which is really hard to pass up. That, and when we started, they were the only commercial laboratory that was doing PLFA and the Haney test together at a reasonable price. And really one of the only labs in the nation that was doing PLFA at a commercial laboratory. So that's why we sent it there, but it's not ideal because it's in Nebraska and their soils are very different, and they just don't, not that they don't have expertise, they do, but it's probably not the lab that the producers are using. They're probably using a more local lab. And so there is a little bit of discontinuity there. And so I wanted to show this soil report and just like very quickly walk through. So I pulled just a random one from this year, and they're all going to say my name on it because I'm the one who's submitting them, because I want to keep the producers anonymous. And they just say when they received it and when they reported it. They're really quick. So there was only 4 days between when we sent them in and when we got data. And then this is the designator for the field that this is for. And so the first thing I look at when I get a report, or when someone asks me about a report, is I look at the soil pH, and then I immediately look at what method the lab used for phosphorus, because it does matter. And so if you have a soil pH above like a 7.5, you should probably be doing Olsen. And so that's what this one is. It's Olsen P, and I had to tell the lab specifically to run Olsen. So that means that you can somewhat compare it to other soil reports you've gotten from a more local lab like Stukenholz, but it's not a direct comparison because there's different, there's variability, a lot of variability between labs. So you should be consistent with the lab you use. And then I also just look at these numbers to make sure that phosphorus isn't really high. And the only time we really expect phosphorus to start getting high is if you're applying compost or dairy manure. And so just think about that. And again, these soil samples were taken, the crop was already growing. So then I like to look at personally this nitrate. And this particular report tells us what the parts per million is, and then also how many pounds there are. And so on this one, there's quite a bit of nitrogen there, which, given the time of year, it's not super concerning because this producer probably applied their fertilizer at the beginning of the year. But it's just something to keep in mind, and maybe ask yourself, is it possible to split application of nitrogen so that there's less of a leaching risk? And then at this 12 to 24 inches, which is at the very bottom of this box, that's not terribly high, but it is a little high. So hopefully there's a deeper rooting crop here that is going to be able to use up that nitrate before it leaches any deeper. And so that's a number that we'll also track kind of moving forward to make sure that that number isn't getting bigger year to year. And then also, because we're in dairy manure compost land, just to keep an eye on your salts to make sure that that doesn't get too high. This one looks pretty good. I don't think this producer applies manure. And in general, please let me know if you want to go through your results one-on-one. I don't have time to go through everyone's right now, but I do have time to go to meet with every single producer if they want to on a one-on-one basis to go through this. So kind of getting into the good data, I guess. This was the organic matter percent in 2019 for all of the sites that we looked at. And the average was 2.9%, which I think is a pretty high average for Idaho, especially for Southern Idaho. And so this, I think it makes the point that the producers that are involved with this project are already thinking about soil health, and they're probably already implementing practices to retain and increase their soil carbon. there's several fields that have above like 3 or 4%, which is also crazy. I mean, there's 2 right here, 2 in Camas that are above 5%. And I was looking kind of through these a little bit and trying to figure out, you know, what was going on. And a lot of these higher organic matter ones are, they're perennial pasture land. So then in 2020, again, we're looking at it. We had an issue with the lab this year where some of the sites didn't get organic matter. I've reached out to them because they should have that information because it's kind of one of those automatic things. They had a lot of turnover this year within that lab. And I think it was just, it was missed on the reporting part, but they should have that data. So just to add that, and when we get it, we'll update those reports with these producers. But this year, the average was a little bit lower than that 2.9%. But I like to remind everyone we lost 1 site and we added 2 more. And also there's year-to-year variability. And I'll kind of get to that. But again, we have several sites that are at that above 4%, almost 5%. A little bit the same ones as before, but also a little bit different. And so that's what this graph shows, is what was the difference between 2020 and 2019. And it was really interesting to see that most of them decreased, but there's variability year to year in these soil samples. So we tagged the locations where we took them and we go back to those same ones, but there's always going to be variability in the fields. Some of these fields maybe didn't get tilled last year, but they got tilled because they went to potatoes or something like that. So you have a little bit of loss. I think if you're looking at this Cache 3 site that had 150% increase, that was starting this year. It was a no-till site that had some compost applied. So I think a little bit of compost got submitted with the soil. And so that's one of those situations of sitting down one-on-one. But the fact that these got lower is not concerning. We're only 2 years in, and that's why this is a 5-year project, is to kind of go through and have a longer trend. So you're going to have a lot of year-to-year variability. It's going to go up and down, but hopefully it goes up and down and slowly trends upward in that variability. So that's kind of why we need this to be the full 5 years. And the average kind of difference was positive. It was 3%, although most of the sites, quote, lost organic matter. And again, the more years we have, the better this is going to be. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of soil testing and how to do that. There's a lot of really great resources. Everyone should be soil testing, hopefully in the spring. Maybe in the fall, but hopefully spring and fall, so you can evaluate, is your crop actually uptaking all of the nitrogen that's there? Because it might leach over the winter and then you miss it when you soil sample in the spring. But so you do the soil sampling, and there's a lot of great resources through the university about how to do this. You get a soil test result, and again, every lab is a little different. So if anyone has any questions or wants to walk through their specific soil report from a different lab, I'm always happy to do that too. And then you use that soil test and you make some recommendations to fertilize. So you're not under or over fertilizing, because you'd hate to be on either side. And so you take into account what crop you're planting, what your soil type is, and things like that. And there's, again, these really great resources on how to do that I can share with you if you send me an email. And then just to keep in mind, in general, best management practices for both manure, compost, and fertilizer, to make sure that you're using the right source. So if you're using compost a lot, like every year, maybe switch to you'll probably need to switch to a phosphorus based for crop uptake. And maybe even if you're not using it every year, apply just for phosphorus and then apply extra nitrogen with inorganic fertilizer. You want to do the right rate, so you need to plan for what crop you've got, the right times. It's best to try and apply those nutrients when the crop needs it and not too much before. And then the right place, so avoid water bodies, edge of field, things where it could be a risk. The next steps for this project is we're still working on data analyses. We did get almost all of the producer information for management practices for this year, but we still cut it a little bit close. So we haven't really been able to dig into that, but it's coming soon. We're going to do the full suite of practices next year in the same locations, the same fields, including aggregate stability. And we're hoping to do soil Your Undies again. And this project would not have been possible without all of these, with all the conservation districts, the commission, in general, NRCS, a ton of participating producers, university personnel. There's too many people to thank individually, but this has been an amazing project to be involved with. So then I'm going to leave you with the last thing of one more poll question, and I can take questions while we work through this. Is what are some topics that you'd like to hear more about? I always like to make sure that I'm talking about things that people are interested in it and not just talking. And sometimes what I think people are interested in may not be what people are actually interested in. So this one, hopefully you can check all that apply. Let me make sure. Yep, you should be able to check all that apply here. And I've seen some questions come in on the chat. Okay, these were kind of during it. But if everyone checks out this chat, Pat Purdy mentioned that there's a really interesting podcast focused on soil testing with Rick Haney and John Kemp. It's called the Regenerative Agriculture Project podcast. Apparently, it looks like you can only check one option again. But they must have updated this because they must have updated this thing. It's okay. It's kind of, well, let me see. Unlimited. Maybe now. I don't know if it'll update, but it might let you now.
Yeah, it's letting me check multiple ones now.
Okay, sorry about that. I think, yeah, this program is, I really like the program, but I think they updated it because I had a little bit of trouble this morning. I still highly recommend it if you're wanting to do these kinds of polls. Let me see. And so I'm happy, kind of while you guys are filling this out, I'm happy to take any questions or comments you may have.
Linda,
Yeah.
this is Carolyn.
How are you? Yeah.
Good. I just wondered, when will we be getting the soil test results?
I sent them out. Maybe I sent them. I know I sent them to David, and I might not have CC'd you on it, but I thought I did. I can resend them though.
If you would, that would be good, because I know our producers would like to see them, and,
Okay.
and I haven't seen them.
Okay, I will send them along to you. I know I sent them to all the DCs, and I usually CC you, but maybe I didn't. It's been a little bit, but I will make myself a note right now.
Okay, thank you.
Say, Linda, I have a question.
Yeah.
On that high organic matter graph that you had there that showed the higher amounts on the non-inverted tillage ground up in camas.
Yeah.
How long was that in vegetative cover like that? Has that been like permanent pasture for quite some time, or?
Which one?
Well, I think you had mentioned it was in permanent pasture on number 3.
So Camas 1, 2, and 3 are all, they've been in pasture for, I think all of them over 10 years, if I remember. I think one of them is close to 20. This Camas 2 is a dry land site, and actually so is Camas 4. So they're not getting any water at all.
Okay.
It's also interesting that this Camas 4, this site never receives fertilizer. And so I was very shocked because you sort of need, they're growing crops, but they're removing a lot of the biomass with the crop. And it is no-till or reduced tillage. And they are doing cover crops and things like that, but they've managed to, maintain their organic matter and not only maintain it, but I imagine it's growing because it's over 2%. So I think that that's pretty cool, and kind of trying to dig into that a little bit more to see how that process went. And I think it has to do with, it's a dry land site. So I think it's overall trying to keep it very low input because the yield just isn't that high.
Yeah. Well, still, it's pretty neat to see on a graph like this how that can stand out to relay the non-inversion minimal tillage aspect of things for organic matter.
Right. Yeah. Almost all the ones that are above average are kind of permanent. They're perennial. They're permanent pasture, or alfalfa or something like that. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Well, I mean, if there aren't any more questions, we can definitely move on to Jackie. And if you think of something, we'll have kind of more discussion at the end too. And the same thing is, I only really talked about organic matter, but if you feel passionately like you really need to talk about X, Y, or Z, please you can put that privately in the chat box to me or to everyone, or send me an email, and I'm happy to start incorporating that. But I just didn't want to kind of just get too far into the weeds when all of these management practices are so different. But I'll turn it over to Jackie.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, what Linda was just saying, of please give us feedback of what you want to hear. That's kind of what this all is about. It's an interactive project, and a lot of people are involved, and we have a lot of different expertise at the table, from producers to conservationists to extension folks. So please reach out with any feedback.
You will not hurt our feelings.
All right, I'm about to share my screen. I'm just going to throw the slideshow on here. Can I do that? Share screen. All right, is that doing what I wanted to do? Linda, am I good? Okay. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to share some kind of fun findings from the Soil Your Undies campaign this year. This is an idea kind of brought into the picture here by Linda, and she and I worked together this year to clean a lot of underwear to help bury and dig some up. And so I'm going to go through kind of the rationale behind this project, and it was borrowed from NRCS folks. I believe it's been done in Canada and Oregon and a couple other different places. So it's kind of a cool project that we're bringing here to Southern Idaho, and hope to keep continuing. So without further ado, here we are. Is that working? Nope. There we go. So first off, I want to give kind of an overview of how this works and what it's supposed to tell us. It isn't about just burying dirty underwear here, but it is actually supposed to tell us and does tell us something about soil health. So basically at the beginning of the sampling season this year, we planted new cotton underwear at the site we were curious about. So in this case, it was at all the Magic Valley Soil Health Project producer sites, in addition to extra sites if producers or DCs were interested in extra sites. Really important to market. We marked it with different materials, wooden stakes in areas that might have animals or machinery going through, and plastic or wire flags in other locations. And we also marked it with GPS so that we would be able to get back. We were able to recover most of the underwear, but I am going to throw out here right now that there were some that were lost for various reasons, whether they were eaten by animals, eaten by machinery, or simply lost in a lot of foliage. The next step, why is that not working, was waiting. So this is a bit of a waiting game. We planted these for the most part in early June, and then we waited about 8 weeks for the microbes to do their work. The idea behind this whole concept is that microbes, the fungi, bacteria, actinomycetes that are in the soil will break down the cotton parts of the underwear, and they'll leave the rubber parts, so the waistband and parts of the seam, behind. So we would have something to recover even if the microbes were extremely active. We'd still have that rubber waistband and the seams around to recover. And the idea is that the amount of cotton that was decomposed or broken down over that 8-week period should correlate roughly with the activity of the microbes in your soil. And as we all know, and as we've talked about quite a bit, the activity of microbes in your soil is extremely indicative of your soil health. After that 8 weeks, we dug up the undies, or the ones that we could find. And now we're sharing those results. So I'm just going to show a quick video here of actually digging out the undies, if it wants to play for me. So going out into the field, into various crops, and carefully digging them up. And this is partially for informational purposes, if this is something you're interested in doing in the future, because it is kind of a fun way to see microbial activity in fields, and to compare one to another as well. So carefully digging out the underwear so that you don't lose anything. And that's what they look like. That was kind of middle of the road as far as decomposition goes of the ones that we found, I would say. Nope. So as far as results go, we dug up, we washed very carefully, and we photographed and weighed all of the underwear. The material lost was assumed to be due to microbial activity and decomposition. And the higher the loss, the greater the microbial activity and decomposition was in the soil. We then ranked the underwear based on the amount of weight lost. So we took the before weight of the undies, which was a little bit variable, even though they were all the same kind and size of underwear. And then we subtracted the after weight. And this is in an effort to go beyond just having photographs to show, but actually turn it into some numbers that we could share. And you can see at the bottom here, kind of a pretty big spectrum of decomposition that we saw, from pretty highly decomposed on the far left to barely decomposed at all on the far right. So what I want to do here is kind of a bit anecdotal, since we, again, as Linda mentioned, this project has so many variables involved that it's hard to capture all of the variability between the sites and to really generalize much. So what I am going to do here is show the top 5 decomposed underwear from the Magic Valley Soil Health Project in order. So going down from 5 all the way down to 1. And then I'm going to share either a photo or a little bit of anecdotal information about some of the management practices that were experienced in that field while the undies were buried. Again, I do want to throw out the caveat that this is anecdotal at this point, and this is more of a fun demonstration project. But Lincoln 1 South came in a tie at number 5. Some management notes: it was planted to beans. This field did not see tillage this year. It was double cropped throughout the season and did see a cover crop the year before the beans were planted. Compost was applied 2 years ago. Coming in at that tie for number 5, Caja 2, the extra pair. Management notes: this field was planted to a perennial pasture. Coming in at number 4, the extra pair at Minidoka 1. This was also planted to a diverse and irrigated pasture. Coming in at number 3, Jerome 3. Management notes: this was not to pasture. This one was planted to an annual crop of corn. Minimum tillage: it saw 1 pass of tillage this year. It was grazed. Cover crops have been used for 5 to 6 years, and compost was applied this year. Coming in at number 2, Minidoka 3 was also planted to an annual crop this year, was planted to sugar beets. And you can see, if you look closely at this photo here, that residue was left on this field. And coming in at number 1 is Lincoln 2. Management notes: this is the 6th and last year that this field was planted to alfalfa, so a perennial, and there's been no tillage in this field for the last 6 years. I'm not going to read all these out, but I did want to include the top performing underwear by loss for each district. So if you'd like to take a look here, I've included some photos of the top performers here. Most underwear lost. And there is kind of a nice mixture here, although a lot of the highest performers, again, similar to trends we've seen in biological and chemical results, were in perennial pasture fields, but there are also some high losses in annual cropped fields, including beans in Snake River 2, including corn in Jerome 3. So there are ways of managing fields with annual crops to achieve similar microbial activity as in perennial crops. Just going to leave this up for a second for folks to look at. I did want to point out some kind of general trends that we saw, because it's not as simple as just comparing apples to apples. Again, we're comparing apples to oranges to pears to mangoes in this case. These fields that we planted the undies in were a lot of them were planted to different crops. I have 5 represented up here, but note that crops are only present in this graph that I'm showing if there were 3 or more sites that were planted to that crop. So things that were only planted in 1 or 2 sites, I'm not even showing on here because the variability would be just too high. So in this, we see pasture and hay performing relatively high at % lost. Corn and beans showing relatively high as well. And as we saw in the last one, there was a field that had sugar beets planted that also had very high decomposition of the undies. What I do want to point out here, which I think is the biggest trend that we saw throughout the season, is that the small grain crops showed the least % lost in the undies. And this isn't because small grains are inherently bad for soil health or anything along those lines. It has to do, we think, with the fact that of those 8 weeks that the undies were buried, it was towards the end of the growing period for these small grains, and they were starting to be droughted. So many of these fields experienced 3 or 4 of those 8 weeks with no water added. And as we all know, microbes require water for life and activity. And so we think that a lot of the lower loss in those grain fields had to do significantly with the amount of water in the fields. So moving on from the Magic Valley results, I want to share with you, we also planted a lot of underwear at the Kimberly Research Farm. And we did this for comparison's sake, because at the Kimberly Research Farm, there are 2 soil health related long-term research projects going on that allow us to be more quantitative with this Soil Your Undies campaign and get a better idea of what's causing what in the field. So in one of these studies, in the long-term manure study at the Kimberly Research Farm, manure has been applied over a period of 6 years, 8 years. Linda, can you correct me on that?
8 years.
8 years at differing rates. And so there is a control where nothing has been added, a fertilizer fertilizer treatment where a standard fertilizer program has been applied, and then differing rates of manure application at either every year or every other year. And so in this graph here, we can see the amount, again, percent loss of the undies due to the different treatments. This graph is kind of busy. I'm going to break it down for you a little bit. What we saw in general was that regardless of the amount of nutrients applied, the manure, whether applied annually or biennially, plots showed significantly greater or a lot more decomposition of the undies than did either the fertilizer or the control. You can see this in graph form here, annual and biennial. There wasn't a ton of difference whether compost was applied annually or every other year, but if compost was applied, there was a lot more decomposition of the undies than in the fertilizer or the control. So this is interesting. It kind of makes sense, right? Manure applied, increased decomposition, increased microbes, etc. This one was very interesting. This was a separate study in which there were multiple factors looked at. So fields were treated either with manure or no manure, cover crop or no cover crop, and conventional till or no tillage. So again, this was a multiple factor study. So fields received one treatment of the manure or no manure, a treatment of cover crop or no cover crop, and a treatment of conventional tillage or no tillage. Again, this graph is pretty busy here. It's hard to see what's going on, so I'm going to break it down again. By manure and cover crop, if no manure was added, no cover crop on the left and cover crop on the right, we see not as much of a difference as between the no manure and the manure added. We saw quite a bit more decomposition when manure was added, regardless of whether cover crops were used or not. So it seems as though the effect of manure may be greater than cover crops. Again, this is anecdotal evidence, so nothing statistically significant that we can share right now because of the amount of variability, but it is kind of an interesting finding. In tillage, we didn't see a huge difference, although no tillage did show a greater percent loss in the undies than did the tillage. So with that, I'd like to open the field up to questions, comment, etc. I do see quite a bit of chatter in the chat box here, so I'm just going to start moving through that. Before I do that though, Linda, I wanted to ask if you had anything to add to this.
I don't think so. I thought overall, this is a pretty cool kind of project demonstration to do this year.
And we're excited to do it again, hopefully next year. All right, I am opening up the chat box and I'm going to go through these questions. Did it make a difference in the type of plant they were in? Yes, it did seem, as I mentioned, that the small grains saw less decomposition, but from our discussions this year, it seems as though the effect may be due to water as opposed to due to the crop itself. and also the trends that we've been seeing both with this and with the chemical and biological results, that pasture and perennial alfalfa did seem to show greater decomposition than some of the other crops. Next question was, did you notice any differences between underwear grown in row crops versus narrow rows like wheat and barley? Ooh, we did not actually look at that difference, but I will draw that up because that is a good point. So you're talking about like drilled versus in planted in rows. Is that correct, Lance?
Yes.
Okay. No, I didn't look at that, but that's a really interesting question that I'd like to look at. From Marlon, interesting that the fertilizer treatment didn't seem to help or increase microbial decomposition. Agreed. It seems as though maybe it was the carbon food source of the manure that helped to drive that microbial food web. But again, this is all anecdotal at this point, but very interesting that manure had such a great effect. And then Cooper's question, is this manure, aged stock manure, or composted manure? Linda, I think you have a bit more information on that study than I do.
So for the long-term, the 8-year one that had a bunch of different rates of manure application compared to no manure or no fertilizer and just a fertilizer control, inorganic, that one was stacked manure. It wasn't super aged, but it was not, like super fresh either. It had kind of been stockpiled for a little bit before applied in the fall. And then on the one that had, cover crop or no cover crop, manure, no manure, or tillage or no till or reduced till, that was kind of it wasn't a true compost, but it was aged. So it's stable-ish. So it's kind of like an ag compost, not fresh. So it was a little drier. And they're applying it at a pretty low rate compared to probably what a producer would. And I should also add that when we say cover crop, it was technically a double crop, although not every year was the triticale able to be harvested. But it was planted it was planted in the fall, and it had a stand through the winter.
A question from Sharon Hardy just came in. So are you finding that chemical fertilizers are possibly damaging microbes, not helping them? So I don't think that we can say anything definitively from this study. Again, it's an anecdotal evidence based on underwear decomposition. But what we can say from the results that we saw this year is that the manure seemed to be driving the food web more than the fertilizers did. And whether that has to do with the fertilizers themselves damaging the microbes or whether it has to do more with the compost feeding the microbes, I can't say from this study.
But sorry, I'm going to add in, there is a lot of, not a lot, but there is research, there just hasn't been a ton of studies that have shown that manure and compost contains carbon, which microbes need more than any other nutrient. And that it increased, so manure compared to inorganic fertilizer, even at the same, nutrient application rate, the manure or compost increases nutrient cycling, so microbial activity, microbial abundance, soil respiration, those metrics. So I imagine that's what's going on here, but we don't have that data. Actually, ARS is collecting it. And so we're hoping to collaborate and go even further to see, can we correlate the underwear decomp to some microbial indice in that soil, because they've got a lot more resources than we do, which was one of the benefits of, putting these undies in some research plots.
And it will be interesting as well to look at this if we do continue it next year, to look at this alongside the PLFA results. Questions of who's where. Any other questions, comments, things you'd like to see looked at with this data? Because this is really kind of an interactive and fun project that we're excited about.
Lance put a question in the chat box. What surprised you about the results?
I guess I can open that up to anyone. Is there anything from what we've shown or from what you know that surprises you?
I can get the ball rolling, but I think someone else should also answer. I was actually just really I had very low expectations going into this. I was a little bit afraid that we were going to bury 100+ pairs of underwear, wash them all up, and put all the work in to have, 0 pairs degrade. So I was just very pleasantly surprised with, in all the producer fields and everywhere of how much degradation we actually had. Compared to, looking at the pictures that we got from the Magic Valley are very close, if not exactly the same, of, fields like this, these underwear buried in fields in the Midwest that have been doing these practices for, a decade, which I think is really exciting. So, and also surprising. But I would love.
I'll chime in there. I was surprised to see, and again, I think this goes along with some of the biological results we found last year, but the expectation and general trend of perennials and alfalfa and long-term no-till sites having the highest rate of decomposition would be more or less expected. But I was surprised to see that sugar beets, there was a field of sugar beets that had as high decomposition of the undies as did some alfalfa and perennial pasture, and same with corn and same with beans. So I was surprised, but also kind of explained to some degree based on management some of these results. So it's sort of echoing. It's cool to see that these practices really are working.
This is Marlon. I was kind of interested in the fertilizer application because we've been teaching that when you fertilize, it kind of shuts down the plant so that it doesn't feed the root exudate out into the soil as much. And so that was just kind of a little bit of a confirmation to me. Anecdotally, right?
Right. I think that that's a positive for, being in dairy land where we have a lot of available compost and manure. This is positive. So hopefully we can get those products, those carbon products spread out more to reduce those hot spots where it's over applied as a hope, maybe low hanging fruit to kind of jumpstart your microbial processes.
Yeah, it seems like the manure application, the plant still has to work for it a little bit, unlike the synthetic fertilizer, right? It still has to send out some exudates and promote the microbial community because they're gonna turn over that material, so you've got that carbon source both from the manure and from the plant fueling the microbial community, and that seems like that's probably a winner of a deal when used judiciously, so. And yeah, Magic Valley, that soil carbon amendment thing seemed like if it was applicable anywhere, Magic Valley could be a real winner there. So good stuff, you guys are really good.
So Steve brought up the manure versus root exudates. It seems as though the exudates would be more effective for microbe feeding with respect to cover crops. And yes, it may be a question of amount, of quantity of the actual carbon that's making it into the soil with manure versus the cover crops. And as Linda said, it was double cropping as opposed to true cover cropping. So there may be a difference there as well.
Yeah, Jackie, I think that business of root exits, the amount of carbon coming through the roots, gives people fits, because and tied to that carbon, there's a certain amount of nitrogen as well, right? So you're talking about really putting some resources into the soil that were what they were fixed through the atmosphere. It's like magic. It's hard to measure. And like I said, I think it gives people fits, and there's these nutrient balances that are hard to account for, like that one organic matter spike and the results that we talked about for a while. How's that soil able to maintain like that, right? We're continually harvesting, yet it somehow replenishes itself. Well, Mother Nature figured that one out quite a while ago, I think, but we just have a heck of a time measuring it. So I'll get off my soapbox on that issue, but it's interesting stuff to talk about.
So it looks like there's a couple more questions in the chat box. I noticed that there's a few people that have started hopping off, and that's 100% fine. But I'm going to launch this poll that I hope you can all kind of take. It's super short. We're just trying to, again, make sure that we're giving everyone the information that they want and need, and kind of just seeing how we can maybe do better in this as well. But I'll leave this up, and we can keep working through some of these questions.
So yeah, Sharon mentioned or asked the question, was cotton chosen because it breaks down faster and is a more natural fiber? Yes, it was chosen because it breaks down. It's a natural fiber, and also for cost reasons. Cotton underwear are pretty cheap. And so we were able to purchase quite a lot of pairs to bury and use in this study. So this is a really cool way of looking at microbial activity, in part because it's accessible to anyone. Anyone can go bury a pair of underwear in a couple of different fields and dig it up a few months later and see if there's a difference. And so I think that that's a lot of the draw to this type of study, is that it's really, really accessible to anyone.
I will also add that these particular underwear are good because we know if we can't find them. So if there's nothing left, the waistband is not going to be degraded in 8 weeks. There's just no way. So if we can't find them at all, we know that either we weren't exactly in the right place. When we were digging up some of these, there were some issues with smoke. So GPS, we had a difficult time actually locating, exactly in the field where we needed to be, but also maybe a critter. Some of these fields were grazed. Maybe a critter walked off with it. Maybe we didn't catch it before harvest, things like that. Although a lot of the pairs, when it was harvested, we were still able to get them. It just, some of them were lost. So that was kind of one of the other benefits of this is it's not that it was so healthy that it was 100% loss. You expect to see that waistband.
I had a question too. I missed out on all the fun of the digging, but as I look at these pictures of all these little itty bitty pieces of underwear, how did you guys sift that out and clean that out so you could put that there on display? Is there a process or a easier way of doing it than not doing it?
We sieved underwear. So
with a very fine sieve.
Yeah, to kind of capture all those little pieces. They're also after 8 weeks, they're very fragile, which is another reason why we felt like pictures maybe didn't totally do it justice, is as we were sort of rinsing them, some of them would just kind of tear, which, I mean, you don't really have a loss, but it looks like there was more degradation because they were brittle or things like that. But it was fun. I'll also add that the president of the university visited our center when my lab looked like just a laundromat of underwear hanging on these like string clotheslines to dry. And that was kind of fun to do too. Just hopefully he remembers me now. Remembers his project.
David, maybe I see that you have a comment. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I just want to just make a comment, not in any way putting down the results or anything. I've had some experience with the buried underwear once in Logan, Utah, back about 8 years ago, and the level of deterioration on the underwear was quite low, and so the results you showed here were quite a bit better than what we had there in Logan. I was really impressed with some of it. In fact, how much some of them were gone, just leaving the waistband. That actually coincided with or relates to, I was in North Carolina at a training. We were on an organic dairy that had been organic for, I think, 10 or 15 years. And we were there for 2 weeks. We buried the underwear day one. And the last day we were there, we've dug them back up and only the waistband was there. So I guess that kind of shows the two extremes. And I'm not making any comparisons whatsoever, because we're talking a very organic system. There was tons of earthworms. Manure piles would disappear in 48 to 72 hours. Very warm, very moist, completely different conditions. But what we've done here, what you guys have done here, is I think it's phenomenal, because now we have a benchmark, and moving forward, we can see what is typical for around here. And maybe we can use that as a metric for, improvement over the years. So thank you for everything you've done. I thought that was fascinating.
Thank you, David.
I see one more question that we might have missed. Does the pH of the soil affect the results? And that's a good point. We didn't look at that, although I think all of them except for maybe 1 or 2 fields are above like 8.3. We have like 1 or 2 that were in kind of more of the high 7 range, but that is something to look at. And even, this question brought to mind, maybe we should be looking at, going back to look at the producer results to see, how does this compare with organic matter content? Because we have all that data from this year even, or next year, as Jackie said, to compare it to PLFA or Haney test. Again, those tests are snapshots, so it's just like at one point in time, whereas these underwear take into account, a longer period of time. So I think I actually think that these underwear are a pretty good metric, and one that's pretty cheap. Yes, so they're more alkaline. They're calcareous soils. We have a lot of calcium carbonate.
I had a question, Linda.
Yeah.
Would it be useful at all to compare the chemical soil test results with maybe the results that the farmers would have taken like earlier in the spring? Would that help you at all? I'm just curious.
Maybe, but we would look at, so if any of the participating producers or any producer wanted to work through some nutrient management planning to improve like maybe their fertilizer program or anything like that, then those tests would be really important. But I doubt that they're sending their soil to Ward lab. So it's still a little bit apples to apples to compare like nitrate and organic matter, but it's also close to apples to oranges. Just because there's variability within a lab, but there's also a lot of variability between labs. But I think producers should definitely probably focus more on their spring tests, unless they're in a perennial system. Then, they could be pulling these soil samples kind of at any time, and maybe our soil testing is pretty good for them.
Okay, I mean, I thought just more for our benefit, not necessarily for their benefit, but I was just curious.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. We have so much data. I love data.
Yeah.
But with it, I mean, it's already hard to kind of see through the weeds on all of this, but it's a good problem to have because we have lots of things to investigate.
Yeah.
Especially because there have been a lot of really great questions asked today.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Larry. I had a question with maybe for you guys to add potatoes in your underwear part of it, put it in a field with not so much organic or residue, I guess, and fields that have lots of residue. And the reason I ask is because I rent potato or ground out for potatoes, and I see on my ground where they've left all the barley stubble there, that their production has seemed to be higher than when they're following a crop of silage corn. So, it's interesting to see. Spuds get a kind of a bad rap for being an erosive crop, and sugar beets too. It's hard on the ground. And the sugar beets are kind of proven a little different, that microbials are working. So that would be what I'd like to see.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. And I mean, if we gave all of the participating producers an extra pair of underwear or two, if they wanted to kind of
any average or any additional information from it. But that's one of the challenges and the benefits of working in a place with such diverse crop rotations, is that kind of don't know what we're going to get every year. And hopefully we too have a lot of questions about the impact of potatoes in the rotation and its effects on soil health. So we look forward to hopefully over the 5-year period gleaning more information about that. Some interesting conversation going on in the chat about possibly the compost or manure impacting bacterial populations more significantly or perhaps more quickly than root exudates. And I agree, it would be interesting. And at this point, I think next year, if we are doing this again, the PLFA might give us some insight into that question. So stay tuned. And Bradley, you brought up, it would be interesting to see the effects of soil fumigation in potatoes on underwear specifically, or on soil health in general.
Yeah, along with what Larry was talking about, I would just be curious to see if the fumigated potato fields would have any breakdown at all.
Mm-hmm. So I will throw this out for everyone. Looking kind of at the poll results and also just the people who I recognize on this call, it seems like there's a lot of people who are conservationists and also a lot of producers. And we do intend to do this project again this year, this coming year. And so if anyone wants to kind of test out any, ideas that they have of, maybe Brad, of a field that, one that's being fumigated and one that hasn't been fumigated, and you want a couple pair of underwear, we can give you all the information you need to bury them around the same time. And we can help get them photographed and washed and kind of included. It is a pretty cheap way. Or if there's producers out there that are interested, or, like maybe there's a new practice that you're seeing that maybe you don't want to spend $150 on these other more comprehensive soil tests. Not saying it's a gold standard by any means to bury some underwear, but some low-hanging fruit.
I could probably find money in my budget for some underwear.
Yeah, I think you can get, like, I was buying like 15 packs off Amazon for about $1 a pair. I had to do a lot of explaining to the university of why I was buying
Hundreds of pairs of underwear.
of men's underwear. But once you get past that hurdle, it's pretty easy. It is a lot of work to get them washed, but having multiple people work on it is pretty helpful.
And Sharon, how deep did you plant the undies? We planted the undies so that the band was just above the soil level so that it would make it easier to find it and so that all the cotton was buried.
It was about a 6 inch, about 6 inches deep, and maybe kind of like a mini trench that was 6 inches deep and maybe 3 or 4 inches wide on top. And you just sort of like fold the underwear in. Kind of the bottom of the leg holes come up on the other side of that trench, but does not, reach soil surface. Jackie made a really nice video of burying them. And so we can share those resources.
So were they all large size, medium, or what size were they? Were you using?
I think they were large. Yeah, so I was consistent. I only bought Hanes and I only bought large. There's still a lot of variability in kind of the pre-weight of those, but not as much as you think. And you're just trying to keep one thing consistent.
But that is why, we weighed all of the underwear ahead of time so that we could compare that pair of underwear beginning and end.
And then we also labeled the waistband so that when we were collecting them, it just in case they got separated from their identifying piece of information, you still had a labeled waistband, kind of like what your mom used to do maybe before you went to camp. And we did not pre-wash them.
Yeah, Larry again. Have you ever smelled the soil before you dig the underwear? Smell the soil and then dig the underwear, see how it correlates with the smell of the soil for what it biodegraded. I will bet you can see a difference and smell the difference too. Because back to my potato comment, is smell the potato field soil compared to other crops. It's got a live smell to it. So it'd be interesting to see the differences that way.
Mm-hmm. Bring some other senses into the picture. I like that.
Yeah, we had this like questionnaire that everyone who buried underwear had to kind of fill out. And that would be something very easy of, does it smell fresh and like soil, or does it smell stagnant and moldy?
Right.
That's a really great point. I love it.
And in any of your work, I had a field man way back that young out of college, but a farm boy, and I rented a new farm, and he pulled the soil samples on it and walked across the field, and he was take the handful of dirt before he dumped it in his bag and smell it. And he come back and he says, "Man, Larry, this is a good farm. Just smell this soil." And it did have high in production or fertility, I guess. So there's a correlation there. And I think we as farmers can do a lot just by the smell of our soil.
That somehow that doesn't seem surprising with the way we're sensitive to that chemical that gives that earthy smell. That it's called geosmin. That I read something about that our noses can detect that in terms of parts per million. That we are very sensitive as creatures to that particular chemical, and so I think that's a really interesting comment, and it deserves probably to be on that sheet like Linda suggests.
On a tour with Gabe Brown a month or so ago, that's their main test, is smelling it, testing whether it's bacterial or microbial. It's pretty interesting. I could start picking up on it, but it's pretty slow.
It would actually be really cool to do some sort of like get someone who's more of an expert in that, like Gabe Brown or something like that, who can almost do like a workshop of, because I mean, I can smell the difference between, you know, this smells fresh or moldy, but like you can go beyond that too with a little bit of training. That would be kind of cool. I'm probably just getting off topic now, but yeah.
Hey, Brad, this is Marlon. I've smelt dirt my whole life, and I didn't realize it, but when I was smelling it, used to not have any smell because it was a conventionally tilled system. It was low biological fertility systems, and that's how I grew up. And so I never smelt good soil. And years ago, I went to Nez Pearson. We went to the prairie with Kevin Seitz, the Camas Prairie, and we dug some native prairie soil up there and left it overnight in a bag. And I could not believe the aroma that soil had. It just blew me away. It was at the office in Boise, and I shared it. I said, smell this. They thought I was crazy, but it was maybe the first time in my life I smelt soil that's how it was supposed to smell. It's just really intriguing to me.
Yeah, we all love that fresh soil smell, but they take it a little bit farther.
Any other questions, comments before we close out for the day?
Jackie,
Yes.
this is Pat Purdy. Sorry.
Hi, Pat.
I just wanted to go back to that comment I made about that podcast, that John Kemp podcast. I would encourage anybody who's involved with soil testing to listen to that. It really kind of has turned my whole view of soil testing on its head. I think it'll challenge your thoughts and practices on what you've been doing for soil testing. So I would encourage everybody to listen to that and just kind of take away your own, whatever you get out of it. But to me, it's confirmed some things that I had long suspected, and it's also encouraged me to really redirect my efforts and change where I get my soil tests done and my soil test methods from top to bottom. So
Thank you for sharing it. Yeah, I have gotten a chance to listen to part of that podcast, and it was very interesting. Awesome. Well, I do want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without you all. So really, really appreciate it. And again, just going to invite feedback to myself, to Linda, to Shawn, to anyone in this project. Please feel free to reach out with any thoughts or suggestions or feedback for these types of events. We look forward to continuing this project and keeping on learning more. So thank you. Thank you.